So let's do another English language A-level video, this time about another language diversity topic. And today we're begging the question, regional dialect forms in the UK, are they disappearing? Now let's get our terms right. Dialect is about lexis and it's about grammar. So disregard phonology, disregard accent features. We're talking about the actual words themselves and the structures of sentences and inflections. That's dialect. So, do we think that they are disappearing in the UK? Have a think. Do you totally agree with that as a statement? Do you totally disagree? Do you have mixed kind of feelings? Hopefully, by the end of this video, you may be a little bit more certain in where you would put yourself on that continuum. Okay, so let's deconstruct this kind of A-level question, evaluate the idea that distinctive regional dialect forms in the UK are disappearing. This is a typical AQA Paper 2 Section A question about language diversity. You've got the command verb at the beginning, evaluate, which remember means to analyse, looking at both sides of the argument and coming to some kind of balanced judgment. Okay, and so the focus is on an idea, so it's not enough just to give a whole load of examples of regional dialect, but there needs to be a conceptual kind of argument that runs through your essay. Okay, so if we're going to do justice to this kind of essay, we're going to have to deconstruct it. So you'd have to identify what are the most common non-standard dialectical grammar features in the UK, so we'll do that in a minute. You'd have to think also about lexical items as well. So what are some of these traditional dialectical lexical items, vocabulary features that we have in this country? And I suppose you'd also be asking, are new regional dialect forms of lexis and grammar, are they emerging in certain parts of the UK? And finally, what evidence is there of dialect levelling, which means that kind of standardisation of language, so that language is more homogeneous across the country. Okay, let's start with a transcript of a court case in Leeds. So we're in West Yorkshire here. This is a few years ago in 2016. And let's look at a transcript of a defendant being cross-examined by a barrister. And your job is to try and identify and describe all of the dialectical non-standard grammatical features here. We're not talking about lexics and we're not talking about accent features. It's about the grammar. So it starts like this, and this is an example of what you're doing. So the barrister says, so would you explain to the court what happened next? And the witness says, well, me and Joe were shopping. So me and Joe. And notice I've highlighted me and Joe there. Well, that's non-standard pronoun usage. Okay, and it's non-standard because usually in standard English, me is the first person singular object form of the pronoun. But here, this phrase here, this is actually performing the subject of that sentence. So here, the object me rather than the subject I form of the first person singular pronoun has been used, and therefore it makes it non-standard. It doesn't make it incomprehensible. We understand it immediately straight away, but it just makes it non-standard. Okay, so have a look at the rest of the transcript and what can you identify? You should be able to come up with something like 10 different non-standard dialectical grammatical features. So, would you explain to the court what happened next? Well, me and Joe were shopping and we were stood in queue at Boots when I says to Joe, see him over there? That's the bloke what was following me the other night. So my friend, just to clarify, when you say your friend, do you mean the accused Joe? Yeah. So Joe says, where's he at? And I says, over there next to them magazines. So there's me standing in queue, and Joe goes up to him to have a word, and can you explain what they said to each other? Well, Joe asked him if he'd been following me the other night, and he said he'd never done nothing wrong like. So when I paid up and gone out shop, we walked 10 yards up the street, and back he comes, this time with another lad, and that's when it all kicked off quite bad. Okay, so you should be able to identify about 10 non-standard dialectical grammatical forms in there. Okay, let's have a look at some of these then. So, would you explain to the court what happened next? Well, me and Joe were shopping, so we've already identified that as non-standard pronoun usage, where the object rather than the subject form of the pronoun is being used. And we was stood. Okay, so we've got subject, verb, lack of subject-verb agreement there. So in standard English, that primary auxiliary verb, the verb to be, that would be we were. And you usually actually have that in the progressive aspect because it's a continuous action. So we were standing. We were standing. And so we've got a lack of subject-verb agreement. That's what that one is called. And then it goes in Q. And this is actually quite distinctive towards a kind of Yorkshire accent and dialect. What you've got here is ellipsis because you've got the omission of the definite article the. So instead of the Q, it's in Q at boots. When I says to Joe, right, so this is non-standard in a couple of ways. I mean, the witness here is talking about something that happened in the past. So technically speaking, in standard English, it would be when I said. So the tense would be different. Even if it was going to be spoken in the present tense, that would still make it non-standard because what you've got here is, again, a lack of subject-verb agreement. This is the first person, so we don't usually, in standard English, put an S inflection on the end of a first person singular present simple. I says. So that would make it a non-standard verb formation. And when I says to Joe, see him over there, right, so this is again like the ink Q, this is elliptical. So do you see him over there? Okay, it's an instruction. That's the bloke. What was following me? Now what here is a relative pronoun because it's introducing a relative clause. And usually you'd use what or that if it was impersonal, if you were describing an inanimate object. But here it's talking about a person, it's a bloke, and therefore that's non-standard because it's using an impersonal relative pronoun, where in standard English you would use a personal pronoun, like who. So, was following me the other night, saw me friend. Now, some people would argue, well, this is actually just an accent feature rather than something to do with dialect. Other people would say, well, it's a different form of pronoun that you've got here. So me is usually the first person singular object pronoun. But here, in standard English, you've been using the first person singular possessive pronoun, my. So that could make it non-standard. So the barrister says, just to clarify, when you said your friend, do you mean the accused Joe? And the witness says, yeah. So Joe says, okay, so this is the same non-standard form of the verb as we've had over there. So it's a lack of subject-verb agreement. So Joe says, where's he at? Now, at here is a preposition. So in standard English, that would not be required. So you'd say, where is he? In standard English, you'd say, well, the preposition there is redundant. So where's he at? And I says, again, it's the same lack of subject-verb agreement, over there next to them magazines. Right, so next to those magazines. So those or these are determiners. They're those words that you put before nouns in order to tell you where something is or the number of those things. Okay, and them therefore would be non-standard because them is a first person plural object pronoun. So that's non-standard. So there's me standing in queue. Again, we've got the ellipsis there. And Joe goes up to him. So we've got the use of the present simple verb form there instead of the standard English past tense form, went. Goes up to him to have a word. And can you explain what they said to each other? Witness. Well, Joe asked him if he'd been following me the other night, and he said he'd never done nothing wrong like. So here we've got this emphatic double negative that's being used, and the kind of rule of standard English is that if you have two negatives, then it makes a positive, following the rules of maths. Okay, so in standard English, It would be he'd never done anything wrong. So when I've paid up and gone out, and now, so gone out there is the different form of the verb. That's the participle form of the verb. So in standard English, it would be when I paid up and went out. And again, it's elliptical, went out of the shop. We walked 10 yard up street. 10 yard there is missing the standard English S inflection to indicate that it's a plural. Again, we've got ellipsis, up street rather than up the street. And back he comes, this time with another lad, and that's when it all kicked off quite bad. Okay, now bad in standard English is an adjective, but here it's describing the kicking, that's describing a verb. So in standard English you'd have an ly suffix on the end to make it into an adverb. Okay, so in quite a small space of language there, you've got quite a number of different dialectical, non-standard grammatical forms. Notice that I'm not calling these forms wrong or incorrect. A linguist would say, well, it's just a different form of language to standard English. It's no better or no worse. It's just a different form of English. So in summary, these are some of the most common dialectical grammar features that you're going to find in English. So you're going to find non-standard pronoun usage, where people use the object rather than the subject form. Me and her are going on holiday. Okay, so in certain contexts, it would not be wise to be using that kind of form. If, for example, you're completing your UCAS personal statement and you want to impress your academic tutors that you are yourself, a strong student who's got really good control of the standard English, you don't want to be putting in your statement things like that, okay, because it's non-standard. So here we've got non-standard primary auxiliary verbs. So this is what I've been calling lack of subject-verb agreement. So there's the example, I were waiting for you. Common enough in lots of dialects of English in the UK. You've then got non-standard prepositional usage. In the transcript you said, where's he at? So here we've got, I got off of the bus. So there, that's non-standard because you've got two prepositions right next to each other. You've got non-standard verb forms, and this is very common where people use the participle rather than the past tense form of the verb. So rather than the standard English, have you eaten your lunch? You'll often hear people say things like, have you ate your lunch? Notice how this does not stop you from understanding what the person is saying. So, those people who argue, oh, well, dialect is bad because it makes language unintelligible. You just simply can't understand what they're saying. Well, that's clearly wrong because you can completely understand what they're saying. But it's about appropriacy for the situation. And if you find yourself in formalized situations, like, for example, job interviews for, important jobs in offices, it may well be noticed if you're using these non-standard rather than standard forms. So we've got the non-standard relative pronoun, like that's the car, what I need. So in standard English, that would be that's the car that I need. We've got non-standard demonstratives, like them apples, which in standard English would be these apples or those apples. We've got the non-standard reflexive pronoun. Now, we didn't have an example of that in the script, but it's something like I saw myself in the mirror. Again, some people would say, well, that's actually just an accent feature rather than a dialect feature. We've got your double negatives, okay, which is often done for emphasis sake in order to stress something. Notice how in different language, like in French, for example, the standard form in French is the ne pas. Okay, but it just so happens that in standard English, we think that a single negative should do the job. We have absence of plural inflections. So you have people saying things like, I live 3 miles from college. Again, the absence of the S inflection doesn't affect our understanding because we've got a determiner before it, so we can see that it's a plural concept. So again, it doesn't really matter in terms of our understanding. And then you've got the ellipsis, which is quite common in all sorts of UK dialect forms, and particularly in this Leeds form that we talked about, shut door and put kettle on. And then finally, the one that was on the end of the transcript, so this is adverbial variation. So this is where people tend to use adjectives where in standard English you use an adverb. So she ran real quick. The quick there is modifying, it's post-modifying the material verb ran, and therefore it would, in standard English, have an ly suffix on the end to make it into an adverb. These are the 11 most common dialectical grammar features in English. When people are conversing with each other, they're very, very common. Okay, so and it may well be that, you know, we call these non-standard, but actually they are some of the most common forms that people habitually do in conversation. Okay, so if I were you, I would sort of test your knowledge of what we've done so far by looking at this extract and trying to identify which of these: multiple negation, unmarked by person, non-standard pronouns, non-standard prepositions, non-standard demonstratives, ellipsis, and non-standard verb tenses, which of those are you seeing here? We was going shopping 10 while 12. We were stood there when I says to my friend, that's the man what I saw before. My friend says, where's he to? I says, over there next to them people. He goes up to him and he gets himself up and says, why are you picking on me? I never done nothing wrong. Okay, so if I were you, I'd be stopping the video and just test yourself on what you're noticing here. So we was going, so unmarked by person, that's the lack of subject-verb agreement. We've got a non-standard prepositional usage there, while, instead of the standard English from 10 to 12. Again, we've got the non-standard verb usage of the primary auxiliary verb, we were stood. I says to my friend, so you've got the present tense of the form rather than the past tense form, which you'd have in standard English. We've got the non-standard relative pronoun that's being used in standard English, that would be who. And here we've got another non-standard prepositional usage, so where's he to, where's he going to, presumably. Again, we've got the present simple form of the verb says, the verbal verb, rather than past tense form. We've got a non-standard demonstrative there, so next to those or these people. Again, we've got the present tense form of the verb and the present tense form of the verb there, and here we've got this non-standard reflexive pronoun, his self rather than himself. And then last but by no means least, we've got the double negative, the I never done nothing wrong. Okay, so these are worth remembering. These are, you know, the most common non-standard forms that you're going to get grammatically in English. So to go back to the original question, excuse me, my light has gone off. Go back to the original. Evaluate the idea that distinctive regional dialect forms in the UK are disappearing. That's kind of answering that question about what are the most common non-standard dialectical grammar features in the UK. And in the next video, what we'll do is we'll look at lexis, we'll think about some of the new regional dialectical forms that are coming in, and we'll treat this idea of dialect levelling as well. Okay, thank you very much.